Hey, everybody. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. Thank you guys for being here. We'll give folks just another minute and then we'll get started. All right. Well, we'll get started. Thank you again for everybody for being here. Maybe before, I'll just make sure that everybody can hear me. So if a couple of people can chime into the chat that you guys can hear me okay, that would be awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Barb. Great. So today we've got a 45-minute webinar, and our focus today is really around talking about how to design packaging with circularity in mind. And my name is Saloni Joshi. I'm the CEO and Chief Sustainability Officer at a company called EcoEnclose. EcoEnclose works with brands of all sizes to help them largely with their e-commerce shipping packaging to make it as sustainable as possible while still meeting their sort of budget and operational and aesthetic goals. We work with tens of thousands of brands that range from like mom and pop shops, Etsy shops, up to some of the largest brands in the world, the Patagonias, the Pranas, the Stitch Fixes of the world. And so we have a lot of different sort of experiences with different types of brands. And while we're focused on e-commerce as a business, today I'm really talking about designing packaging to be as sustainable as possible. So hopefully it feels relevant regardless of what kind of packaging you're thinking of. And so how I'm hoping to go through this is very much what you guys saw in the registration agenda. So hopefully this isn't a surprise. But my vision is to first share EcoEnclose's like our vision and North Star for sustainable packaging. Not because I think you all should definitely agree with it, but the hope is that by hearing how we've thought about it, it might inspire you to create for your brand your own North Star. Then to talk about how that vision has translated into our own circular packaging design principles. Again, not because you need to mirror your principles against ours, but to see how we think about it might help you create your own, or ours might really resonate with you. Then we'll touch a little bit on the regulatory landscape. And that's because I think as people are thinking about how to make their packaging more sustainable in the short and long term, given the regulatory landscape in the US right now related to packaging, it's helpful for you to have that background as you think about it. That will take about 20 minutes, and then we'll just really have more of hopefully a dialogue with the chat and answer questions that you might have, hear what you're sort of considering, what roadblocks you're facing, and then close out with hearing from you and me sharing as well some of the practical steps you might consider for the year ahead. So that is what I'm envisioning. If you have questions, thoughts throughout, share them in the chat. I probably won't get to them until we get to that later part of the session. Taylor is on as well. She's on our team. And so Taylor, if you hear somebody or you see a chat that we should address right away, just sort of unmute and please ask so that we can get to it. Awesome. So this is a new technology. I've never used this technology for webinars, but I'm going to try to run a poll to kick us off to just get a sense of how you guys think about the term sustainable packaging. So hopefully this works. So when you think of the term sustainable packaging, would just love to hear from folks, like, what do you think of? What terms come to mind first, or what's the first term that comes to mind? Love it. Give people a couple more. Awesome. Okay, so pretty much across the board, which makes sense because sustainable packaging would be a number of these different things. But I think it's just helpful to hear where people's minds are at. So I'm going to start by talking about how we. I start by saying, like really recognizing the fact that there's no such thing today as truly sustainable packaging. In the most pure definition of the word sustainable, no packaging, including our own, which we're really proud of, is sustainable. It all has sort of a net negative impact on the planet. So with that lens, I think it was about 8 years ago, we took a step back and said, okay, well, what do we think it will look like when packaging is truly sustainable? And so we settled on a North Star. This North Star of circularity is how we use the term. So to us, circularity, when we get there, will be a world in which packaging is made out of packaging and then becomes packaging again, and that the raw inputs that feed into packaging are ones that are net positive for the planet rather than sort of extractive as they are today. And so that became sort of the North Star and the guiding principles for EcoEnclose. And that statement is interesting, but we then created this graphic to help our team and ourselves wrap our head around it. And so the idea here for our North Star is that, today most packaging is made with degenerative virgin materials, right? We're logging forests to make paper, we're extracting fossil fuels to make plastic, we're mining bauxite and silica to make aluminum and glass. And then all of those materials are becoming packaging, getting used by brands, ending up at converters. And the vast majority of it, unfortunately, is still landfilled, or at least it moves out of the circular sort of cycle. And when the world is sort of more circular, when we've achieved the North Star that we've talked about, the vision at EcoEnclose is that we're replacing those extractive inputs with regenerative virgin materials. And then as much as possible, those materials are staying in the cycle. They're getting reused wherever possible. And then they're moving to the recycler and to the reclaimer and to the converter and to the brands over and over again, as much as humanly possible. So this sort of graphic and this vision has become our North Star. And again, you may have a different North Star for yourself or your brand, and I think that's okay. But hopefully by the end of this, you can see oh, okay, I can see how I might create my own. And that North Star is good. We got excited to share with the team. And I think quickly then they said, okay, well, I need more than that. I need very specific design principles that we can adopt so that, our product innovation team, or when we're working with brands, they can be thinking okay, what am I doing? What's the next innovation I'm pursuing? How can I keep improving and bettering my packaging? And so we translated that North Star into actually 10 design principles we use to maximize circularity. I'm going to share 5 of them today, just in the interest of time, and the 5 that are most sort of salient for us. So the first one is a focus on maximizing recycled content, especially post-consumer waste, and especially post-consumer waste that's produced domestically. And the reason for that is, if you think about that circle that I was just showing, that circle is in large part only possible if there's enough demand and excitement for recycled content that's here, such that the US is actually building out the infrastructure to reclaim, to sort, and to remanufacture materials. And that comes from demand. So that's a huge part of our vision. It's probably the number one driver. And then sort of in hand with that is to design for maximum levels of recyclability and reuse where appropriate. And then to do what we can to expand access and recovery rates of those materials. And when we think about designing for recyclability, we're thinking at EcoEnclose about choosing materials that are readily recyclable and whose material is actually valued in the recycled content markets. And then we think about minimizing coatings, inks, et cetera. So the recycled content it creates is actually as high value as possible. And then finally, we think about what is the sorting infrastructure, the recycling infrastructure in this country, and designing structures that work well with that sorting infrastructure. So an example is that many of you likely know that a 2x2 inch thing does not get sorted, even if it's technically recyclable. So we'll try to avoid that wherever possible. So those two first principles, or I guess the first 2 principles for us, are core to the circle, right? If we do this well and everybody did this well, then we'd really be making headway in achieving the circle part of our vision. This third part is really about the arrows in, and how do you go from a degenerative to a regenerative set of inputs. And so EcoEnclose plays a role to catalyze the adoption of regenerative net positive virgin materials. So what does that mean? That means that like the world, like often there are people trying to come up with novel alternatives to today's standard materials. We try to see what's out there. And when we see something that's like really promising, that has true promise at scale to be more restorative or at least net neutral, we want to take the time to help bring it to market. And this is increasingly an important part of what we do and what our brands are doing. And so why is this important? If you think about like, we've been using plastic, paper, materials like that for decades, centuries. And so the world's entire supply chain and equipment infrastructure is all designed around these sort of mainstream materials. And when a novel material comes into market, it has to work with that equipment. It has to like be functionally exactly like the things it's replacing in order for large brands to adopt it. And so the role that EcoEnclose and our brand community has played is to say, okay, when we see really cool materials out there, black algae ink is a great example, or paper made with wheat straw waste instead of made with virgin trees, what can we as EcoEnclose and our community do to commercialize it, to actually get it to convert into usable packaging, and then to work with our brands that are the most likely to be early adopters and innovators to take the risks on a yet untested material, such that those materials can start to get tested, get market exposure, and then eventually become mainstream. So increasingly, that's a really important role that, again, our brand community is playing in order to help replace the sort of red input arrow with a green input arrow. So that's the third part of our framework. The fourth part of our framework is, I think, to recognize that circularity, like the visual I keep coming back to, is a part of the environmental equation, but it's not everything. And so there's, obviously everything from climate change and greenhouse gas emissions to deforestation to water and soil health. And there's just quite a few environmental issues. And we don't want to get so laser focused on our definition of circularity that we lose sight of those. And so just to really consider the entire life cycle more broadly. And how this plays out for us in a number of different ways. I think the most salient way I always say is that, if you just purely focused on circularity, we would probably not sell any plastic packaging at EcoEnclose because paper is more readily made with high post-consumer waste. It's easier to recycle. And then the net input of trees is much more renewable and good for the planet, theoretically, than fossil fuels. But when you take that sort of life cycle analysis view, you start to realize that plastic has a significantly lower carbon footprint than the paper than its paper counterpart. So recycled plastic is sort of here, and then virgin paper is here. So it's a really significant differential. Additionally, we can't be, as a society, over-reliant on trees to make our packaging because the protection of our forests is so critical to both biodiversity and carbon capture and climate change. And so if you think about the nuance there, it's led us to say, hey, we need to actually sell both of the materials and then do the work to make them as circular as possible, to maximize recycled content and recyclability of those. So that's an example of that one framework, that one part of the framework in action. And then the last is, and this is becoming increasingly important to us as supply chains become more and more complex, is once we design something, to do the work to audit whether or not it's true. So we don't want to be selling or using recycled content without knowing if that's true, without auditing the supply chain, potentially getting third-party verifications. We have quite a few now. And the reason for that is we know that the way that we design packaging, we're doing it in order to achieve our North Star over time. And so we want to make sure those things are true. And then increasingly in sort of a regulatory landscape, this is more and more important. So those are sort of the 5 primary design principles. And again, I think you could look at this and say, these do make sense for us. We do want it. This is how we think as well. Or you might think about other things, which I think is fine. Because there's so many different ways to view and think about sustainability. But this next slide was just to show you how we've taken the framework and used it to sort of audit and improve upon the packaging we offer, in hopes, again, that you might turn around and say, let me audit the packaging that's in my sort of brand's portfolio and see how I can use my framework to make it better and better. And so stand-up pouches is a great example of a really environmentally difficult type of packaging that's in the world. Those of you who either use it in your brand or just use it as a consumer likely know that it's made with this multi-layered film. It is almost always virgin, and it's almost impossible to recycle. And when it's made for recyclability, it just generally is not accepted, so it doesn't get recycled. And so as we started down the path of like, how can we make this better? We had this vision of like, hey, we want it to be 100% recycled, and we want it to be recyclable, and try to get bio inputs into it or something like that. And it just was like, this was all impossible to do while also achieving what we need functionally from a stand-up pouch. And so we started down the process of like, okay, how can we get as much post-consumer waste into the pouch as possible to meet the first part of our framework, while recognizing progress over perfection. We have a vision, we're going to get there over time. And so we've been able to come out with a really high PCR pouch to support that effort. Labels and stickers is sort of another fun one. Those of you who use like shipping labels or stickers in your business know that when you like peel the sticker off, you end up with a release liner that is oftentimes silicone coated and virgin material. And for years we were like using our shipping labels and so frustrated internally that we had this virgin landfill bound piece of material. And so over time, we were able to get it to, again, using the first two principles, our framework, find a technology that allowed it to be 100% post-consumer waste and curbside recyclable to make a step in the right direction there. This one is sort of I told you earlier, we do a lot of work in trying to make plastics as circular as possible. And so over the last decade, we've been able to move from a like low recycled content polymailer to one that is 100% recycled functional resin, 50% post-consumer waste. And then in the last year, we created a blend that's really low additive, which allows it to get third-party certified, which meets that sort of fifth part of the framework I was talking about. Because the plastic recycled supply chain is so hard to audit, having that third-party recycled content claim verification on it was such an important thing to us. So we were able to get that sort of released into the universe. And then the last is a reusable mailer. A couple years ago, we released reusable mailers. And we went super deep in that, like the fourth part of the framework of like, let's bring a life cycle sort of approach to this. And so not to just say like, no matter what, reusable is always better than single use, but instead to say, okay, well, we need to get a recycled PET material here. And then we need to do the math to say, how many times does a brand need to make sure that their mailer is reused in order to make it a net positive change for them to go from a poly mailer to a reusable mailer. And for most brands, it ends up being about 8 to 20 uses. So big range, but let's say 8 to 10 uses for most brands. And so then we were able to work with particularly like rental and subscription brands to move reusable into their supply chain because they had a high confidence that they could achieve those reuse rates. So that's sort of like a couple examples of how we take a framework, that our circular principles design framework, and sort of move it into how we think about our existing imperfect set of packaging today and how we try to continuously improve upon it. Our framework has also really helped us think about like complex questions. Like every month I'm getting a question like, oh, there's a new additive on the market that can help plastic biodegrade in a certain way, or like, should we start thinking about FSC virgin over recycled content? Or, you know, how do I think about the bio-derived landscape of packaging? And I'm not going into these in more detail because I think each of these circles could be a webinar into itself. But this is really just to show you how, like, when we get these complex questions, we can now take sort of a research and framework-based approach to more quickly and sort of consistently answer those questions for us at EcoEnclose. And so again, just sort of like keep going back to like why having a decision framework and principles can really help brands navigate a landscape of packaging that's becoming increasingly complex all the time. So that's sort of my spiel on like circular design principles and how to think about them for your business. I'm going to take a little bit of time to touch on packaging legislation, just to give folks a sense of like, if you're creating your own set of design principles for circularity, we are entering a time where I think layering in legislative implications are really important so that your framework sort of like reflects the state of affairs in the US today. And so before I get into a couple of slides on this, I'll do another poll. Hopefully this works. Is just to like get a little bit of a sense of like, is your brand even thinking about some of the US packaging legislation today? And if so, how? And again, if it's not on your radar, that's totally fine. Okay. Awesome. All right, so really across the board. So for some of you not on your radar at all, which again, I think is actually fine given where we are, to brands, oftentimes we're finding that the larger brands out there are actively making changes in response to what's out there. So I'm going to take a couple slides to touch pretty high level at what's going on. I think if anybody wants to dialogue further, we can definitely do so as well, either as the last part of this call or on a separate call. We have on EcoEnclose's website a guide that's really focused on packaging legislation and EPR. And if you go to it, you'll see a lot of content around it. And then you'll also see like a little widget where you can like click on a state and see what legislation is out there. And actually, Taylor, maybe drop the link into the chats in case people want to have access to it long term. But the guide will, if you go into it, you'll see there's like over 200 lines of legislation out there in the US today. And so it could be really complicated to figure out like, how do you wrap your head around this and what does this mean for you? And we found it really helpful to think about it in these 3 buckets. So really most legislation that's related to sustainability and packaging today falls into these 3 categories. So packaging extended producer responsibility, on-package labeling requirements related to packaging sustainability, and then bans or restrictions on materials or packaging inefficiency. And so I'm going to touch briefly on each of them. So packaging EPR, this is the one that's like sort of the most complicated and all-encompassing. And the idea of packaging EPR, for those of you who aren't super aware of it, is that extended producer responsibility means that brands become accountable for the end of life of their packaging, and they have to collectively meet recycling targets and source reduction targets that have been set by the legislation. So that's like in a nutshell how, like what it means. And packaging and EPR in general has been around for products for a long time. It then was released in Europe for packaging, and now we're seeing that trend in the US. And so in the US, 5 states have passed packaging legislation thus far, and there's a number of states that it's under consideration at. But all legislation is sort of still unfolding, so the specifics are still somewhat unclear, and there are no fees or reporting requirements yet. So brands have time. And California, I think most of us are sort of looking at California and saying, okay, let's see how they have their legislation unfold so that we can sort of follow suit and design accordingly. When I think about EPR, there's a lot of nuances, but the 4 things I think that brands might be most sort of cognizant of as they're thinking about this year and future years is the first, like to think about, especially brands of a certain size who meet the threshold, to really start auditing your packaging and to have accurate data on, each type of packaging that you have and that you're putting out there, especially in these 5 states. What is their weight? Are they made with virgin or recycled content? Do they have any certifications? Are they recyclable? So you want to start sort of building a data set of your packaging types and the volumes of each of them so that you can understand where your opportunities for improvement are, but also get ready for the reporting requirements into the producer responsibility organization, which is an organization called CAA. So that's one thing that is sort of a time-intensive process. So getting ahead of it can be very helpful. Brands will then start to incur fees based on how much consumer-facing waste they're generating in a state. So, if you're doing X pounds of this type of packaging, you're going to see a fee that is incurred that you're going to be paying into the pro as a result of that. You're going to start to, once we understand what the baselines are of how much packaging is going into a state, collectively brands will be being held accountable to reducing by weight, particularly plastic, that they're putting into that state over time. So that by 2032, you're seeing a 25% reduction in the overall plastic that's generated in the state, as an example. And then the last bullet is sort of the more interesting, I think the most interesting one in some ways, and really aligns closely with some of the circularity principles I was talking about before. But states will begin releasing guidelines around eco-modulation, which basically means that as brands make decisions to increase the circularity of their packaging, perhaps making it going from non-recyclable to curbside recyclable, they would see a reduced fee structure based on those eco characteristics of the packaging. So it's basically an incentive for brands to make their packaging more circular and eco-friendly in order to reduce the fees. And there's a lot of the specifics on what will count as eco-modulation are still under review and under development, but it's good to know that this is coming because it's a great incentive that will be sort of paired with this legislation. So that's super big picture on EPR and how you might think about about it for your brand. Sounds like some of you are already much deeper into it than that, but hopefully a good review for those of you who are still just getting in there. The second sort of bucket of stuff is labeling requirements. So various legislative states or various legislations in different states are coming out related to recyclability claims, compostability claims, reusability claims, and then the FTC green guides, which many of us are just waiting to get updated. We thought it was going to happen last year, but they have a lot of guidelines around sustainability and recycled content claims. And so what this means, I think, big picture is that as you're starting to make claims, or it will become more and more true that the claims that we make on our packaging ideally need to be third-party verified or easily auditable so that we can be sure that the claims that we're making are true and are in line with what the state says is true. So an example is like California with their SBS 343 Truth in Labeling Act will begin to say, hey, you can only call a package recyclable if it meets their definition of recyclable. And they'll have like a list of all the materials that can be or can't be called recyclable based on, do 60% or more households have access to it? And are we seeing a high enough recycling rate on that material? There's also going to be compostability labeling requirements that you can't say something is compostable unless there's third-party verification against specific ASTM standards. So I'd say big picture here is that you're going to start to see more consistency, rigidity, and direction, and then third-party verification of the variety of sustainability claims you could be making on packaging. And then the last one is probably the most sort of already in motion today, but there's like a number of municipalities and states that have taken steps to ban or restrict specific materials. And so I think many of us are very well aware of the fact that single-use plastic retail bags, particularly really thin ones, are starting to get banned in many states, in many municipalities. And in some places, there's either a ban or like a fee that's being imposed for all single-use retail bags, whether it's paper or plastic. Lots of bans against PFAs and forever chemicals. PVC, because of how toxic it is and how bad for people's health. Polystyrene, styrofoam is starting to get banned. And then in New Jersey, and I believe a couple other municipalities coming out with sort of the idea of potentially putting a ban on excessive packaging, that you can't ship something in packaging that is 2x the volume of the product. And so those are a little bit more in motion, and I think the ones that the brands we're working with are actively addressing today. But I think big picture, these are the three buckets of stuff. And as you guys are thinking, okay, this year or over the next coming years, I'm going to be auditing my packaging and applying, and here are the circularity principles I want to be bringing to my packaging. I think it would be really helpful to be keeping these legislative buckets in mind so that you're sort of prepared for what's to come. So that's sort of the end of my like big spiel about how we think about circular design principles, and really open it up, I think, now more to discussion and Q&A. And so I've got one more poll just to get us going, and then would love to sort of hear what's on your mind, which is just, I think, based on how you think about circularity, or how we've defined it, whatever makes the most sense to you, like how much would you say your current packaging is circular today? All right. So really across the board, a couple people who are really feeling like it sounds like made strong moves already to make their packaging super sustainable, and others that are at the lower end. So that's awesome. Yeah, I'd love to like maybe hear in chat, like what are some of the sustainability improvements you're hoping to bring to your packaging this year, and then maybe some roadblocks, and then also just questions you might have around some of what I shared today, or maybe disputes or various opposing perspectives. All right, radio silence right now. Oh, I love this. Thank you, Rachel. She asked, where do you see seaweed packaging replacing plastic films? I love that. For those of you who aren't aware already, we have well, first we have a partnership with a company called Sway, which has been developing a seaweed-based plastic alternative that's based largely in responsibly sourced seaweed. And we do have a webinar with the founder of that company, Julia, next Thursday, so we can also share more then. But yes, seaweed packaging is so cool. So seaweed packaging I see as like that green arrow in, like we don't want fossil fuels to be the source material for our packaging, for our plastic packaging forever. And seaweed is like one of the most exciting alternatives to it that I can see, because seaweed, unlike a lot of other, right, we've been trying to use corn to replace plastic for a long time, but corn has incredible disadvantages. It's highly chemical intensive. It requires a lot of fresh water. It has a lot of land use requirements, and seaweed is just so awesome because it can be grown without any land use conversion risks. It doesn't require fresh water. It doesn't require chemicals. And when grown responsibly, it can actually restore ecosystems. So we're just like pretty all in right now on seaweed. And we really hope seaweed is an important part of the future. And Rachel, the question is a great one, because from a technology adoption curve, we're still at the early part of it, right? We have film now. Sway has created a great film. We're using it to try to make poly bags and to make retail bags. And we're starting to work with the early adopter brands out there who want to bring it into their supply chain, because our vision, our hope is that 5 years from now, the Sway seaweed bags are like a common alternative to plastic. So that's where we are. And if a brand is interested, I'm hopeful that a month from now, we're going to have stock options on our site that any brand of any size can buy. And if there's any brand out there that wants to buy high volumes of Sway seaweed poly bags, reach out, because we're almost ready to do that. So I'm going to go. Awesome. Thank you, Christina. I'd like to find a way of packaging our products. Yes. That is use at the other end. Bill, that's a great question. So this idea of like, can your packaging, so what Bill said is, I would like to find a way, where did it go? I would like to find a way of packaging our products for shipments, fishing, lures, supplies, and something that has use on the other end so it doesn't get discarded. Which is, I think, awesome. Yeah, I think the reuse model is so interesting. So there's two ways to think about reusable packaging. One is, how do you package in something that then the end consumer can use long term, so that it becomes like a functional thing. So we're seeing a lot of folks now ship in like sachets or almost like reusable bags that they can then just use forever. And so that's one way of doing it, which I think is actually the best way, if you can find a way to package, to make that packaging useful to your end customer. So it's not just like tchotchke that they end up having. But that's like the best in an e-commerce environment. The alternative is that you're shipping in something reusable that then the consumer has to send back to you. And that is really exciting, because then, you can really have long-term reuse and offsetting like the need for single-use packaging. But what you end up finding is that consumers are not sending it back, or there's a cost or carbon footprint for sending it back. And so I'm not, Bill, I think what we're seeing when brands do this is that they are packaging in like maybe sometimes little like containers that can be reused, or almost like sachets that can be reused by folks. So that's been like a really interesting thing to see people almost like what are they called? There's like that alternative to the Ziploc that's like a silicone Ziploc bag. Like we're seeing people use things like that, so that then, okay, all of a sudden you have like a sandwich bag that your customer can use long term. So we are seeing those trends. Barb, you said, do we ship a lot of clothes that are individually polybagged? We're working on making these poly bags out of 100% recycled material. It's been hard. Yes. Great thought, Barb. So we have, 100% recycled poly bags. And it is true that what we are finding is that because people's factories are global, there are some factories that have easier access to that 100% recycled material than others. And then there are some places where it's incredibly hard to get post-consumer waste into it. And, I think that's one, Barb, maybe just reach out, because we might be able to help you find like the right solution. But more and more we are seeing globally that there is access to recycled content in poly bags than we've ever seen before. So hopefully I'm seeing that those hurdles are starting to go away. Jurek asked, what about agro-industrial waste, like raw material? I love this question. My big passion is that we could replace, or we have a close relationship with with an organization called Canopy Planet. And they're really focused on how do we make sure that we're producing textiles and packaging in a way that doesn't pose risk to ancient and endangered forests. And their big focus with us is like, how do we get next gen alternatives to trees into the fiber basket? And so the idea is like trees will always be a way that we make paper, but can we diversify the fiber basket so we're not solely reliant on trees? And so unfortunately, several years ago, we did launch like a wheat straw line and then saw some issues with the wheat straw pulper in the US that went into bankruptcy and has now recently been purchased. And so this is, again, where you go back to that technology adoption curve. Is like, we need brands, we need companies that are like, yeah, I'm going to go all in on these ag waste alternatives so that we can get them to a scale that they can be cost competitive and functionally competitive with tree-based paper. So I said that sad story, but this year there is a lot more progress. We're seeing wheat straws back on the market. We're seeing a lot of people do really cool things with hemp. We're also seeing really interesting like on-purpose crops. There's a company called Genera that's making a very awesome like carbon sequestering, nitrogen fixing on-purpose crop to be converted into paper. And so there is a lot of movement that Canopy is really helping to fuel to get agro-industrial waste into the paper fiber basket, as well as other great on-purpose crops. Yeah, let's see. Bridget, we love you too. Yeah, I would love to promote your sustainable packaging and promotional items on. Yes, we would love that. Microbusiness to calculate a general LCA. I'm so happy that you asked, Christina, about that. We have a calculator on our site that you can. It's not a perfect LCA, so I will not pretend that it is perfect. But we've recently created a calculator on our site, and Taylor, if you can pop the link into the chat, that would be awesome. That is basically being used to say, if you're currently using virgin materials today, what would it look like if you move to 100% recycled alternatives to that? And in that process, like the data behind that, those LCAs are driven from Sphera, as well as the Environmental Paper Network. So the assumptions from those two very like popular tools are being used, and I would say. It's not a perfect LCA, Christina, but it's probably like a really quick way for a small company to get a read on what their carbon footprint of their packaging is, recognizing that there's a bunch of assumptions behind it. So it's not as perfect as like if you hired a consulting agency to do your very pure LCA, but directionally, I think it would be a really good start. Yeah, Barb, you said your comments on sending products in something that will send back to the company for use is good, but there's a huge carbon footprint. It's such a good point. And as we got into reusable packaging, that was like the biggest thing that we realized is that the carbon footprint of shipping, and then also just the fact that the material that's used for a reusable mailer is 5 to 20x the amount of material that's used for a single-use poly mailer. And so just like the amount of times it has to be reused, and also like how closely it is, right? If you're shipping from like New York back to California, that's not great. And so can you have decentralized collection points? So there's a lot there. And so Barb, what we basically said is like, we're only starting reusable packaging with companies that like sending back is just part of their business model. And so I showed a picture of Armoire, and they're a clothing subscription business. And so inherent to their business model is the fact that customers have to send something back anyway. And so that carbon footprint is sort of a wash, and the likelihood that the material, the mailer actually gets back is really high. And we've really found that that's where it makes the most sense. Awesome. And I'm very excited to learn about banana fibers. So thanks, Jurek. Yeah, do we use, Cesar, you're asking about USA-based garment manufacturers. I'd love to better understand the question, because we don't, and I would love to. All right, Cesar, maybe shoot me a note, because I'd love to learn more about the question and potentially work with you if that's a possibility. Awesome. Thank you, guys. This was awesome. I will share this is sort of a summary slide. There's a lot on it, but just like as I was thinking about like, okay, well, if I'm listening to something like this, what might I take away? So these are just some ideas as you think about 2025 and a packaging roadmap and thinking about circularity. These were some tips. So taking the time to really define and or refine your brand's packaging vision and core design principles as it relates to sustainability, increasing, like, auditing sort of your supply or your packaging solutions today, and finding ways to increase recycled content and shifting from post-industrial to post-consumer waste, designing for high quality recyclability, considering onshoring your packaging to support domestic recycling infrastructure if you're sourcing recycled content and potentially doing so overseas right now. If virgin paper is a really essential part of your packaging strategy, strongly recommend mitigating deforestation risk through like an authentic chain of custody FSC certification. And then looking for opportunities to adopt cutting edge materials like algae ink, sway, which we've talked about, sugarcane polymailers where it makes sense that are Bonsucro certified, agricultural waste paper, and more. So it sounds like there's some energy about that in the group, which is awesome. And then the last are really a little bit more regulatorily aligned, but joining CAA if your brand size requires it. That's the pro that's managing all of EPR in most of the states that have released it, and then starting to prepare your data and reporting, moving away from materials and packaging solutions that are increasingly getting restricted, and then considering third-party verification or at least auditing of recycled content, recyclability, and any compostability claims. So just a snapshot of tips. I'm sure you guys have many more things that you're already doing and thinking of, but hopefully this is a helpful sort of summary slide. And yeah, I really enjoyed your questions, guys. Thank you so much. I'd say the last slide, I think, is just my info. So if you want to keep talking, I would love that. This is not my info. This is a generic info, hello@ecoenclose.com. But my email address, if anybody wants to stay in touch, I'd love that, is saloni@ecoenclose.com. And I really would hope to connect and stay in touch with all of you guys. So thank you guys so much for your time today. Have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a great weekend.